Okay, well, I guess you're not here representing them. The other one that you mentioned, or two, I think, in newsprint, oil, one that I'm aware of is aluminium cans, for which recovery is very high. And in all instances, that's because there's some economic value in returning that material, and it's reasonably easy to just close that loop and reincorporate that material in product cycles. But what do we do with the material for which there's no easy economic value for returning? I suppose that the problem that we've got here is that mostly it's always going to be cheaper to dump waste, whether it be a television or beverage container. So what do we do in the instances where the industry is not interested in volunteering?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that the aluminium recovery is more of a commercial process than a product stewardship process. There's scrap value in the material, so there's a commercial value to be paid back for it to encourage recovery. Although there are still some issues involved in that. As cans get lightweighted, you have to recover more cans to get value, and you'll have the normal commodity fluctuations. For the items that do have a cost to manage, especially to local governments, then it makes sense to have some impact. That's consistent with the principles of extended producer responsibility. They do impose a cost on local waste programs to manage, and therefore that cost needs to be addressed somehow. A range of packaging items and aluminum and steel, metals, often have a positive value to those programs. As we discussed earlier, there's a positive impact in the material value that is often available for those items. So an effective RIS process, an effective cost-benefit assessment, I think should also reflect the positive values as well. But where there are the negative impacts, then a reasonable understanding of what the costs currently are, options for addressing those costs, and various approaches should be considered. All too often in these discussions, there is an ends searching for how to get to that ends. If people have a particular policy approach in mind, then they try and influence the process to get to that end game for them. I would much rather see a robust regulatory impact assessment process, key stakeholder engagement, to lay out a range of options across the board and really understand those options and what the impacts, both positive and negative, would be of those options, and then feed that into this process especially before mandating an approach. But often businesses are considering these items anyway, and local governments certainly have a right to be mindful of the costs. One of the things that we find internationally is that all too often local governments don't necessarily know the cost impacts of a particular item that's problematic, and that makes it difficult to value.
We're hearing from local government in a sec. I want to keep your comments to your submission, if I could. You've written there's a clear presumption in the Bill's consultation paper that more utilisation, recycling and higher targets are better. And then you've said, well, there's evidence of some counter-arguments. So give us an example of where more recycling is actually a bad thing.
All right. I think it's important to bear in mind that collection and recycling activities are industrial processes that can have their own impacts. They may actually consume more resources than are saved. The example that comes to mind, too quickly, Finland made an active decision to not recycle materials from rural areas precisely because there was a net impact, that the transport, the impacts, or the low densities simply didn't justify collection from rural areas. Similarly, the European Commission, in revisiting the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, came up with a list of optimal recycling rates for packaging items, and they were nowhere near 100%. And they incorporated that consideration of an optimal recycling rate in setting targets for each of the materials under the Packaging Directive.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, bringing it back to an Australian example would be recycling glass, for instance. It's a very heavy material. There's a lot that can be done with economies of scale, processing, secondary markets in Australia, and it's certainly seen a great deal of growth in the past few years. but there would be some parts of Australia where it just wouldn't make sense to take mixed glass, broken glass, try and color separate it, and ship it to a regional area and ship it halfway across the country in order to meet a market demand. For instance, if you look at green glass, the green glass plant that can take the material is in Adelaide. Are we going to ship a heavy material all across the country to get every last bit of it to Adelaide? Or are there, by looking at other options, can we do local secondary market development to reduce those transport impacts and have a much greater economic value overall as well as an environmental benefit?
I've just had somebody switch on power tools outside my office. Is that coming across the mic, or is that all right?
Yes. Yes. Hope there's no waste being produced, Senator.
I suspect there probably is. Another thing that you've said is that you've got a problem with willingness to pay studies, and I certainly do, but I suspect your concerns are the opposite to mine, is that they may overstate the general public's actual willingness to pay. I've got a real problem with the way some of these models are used in regulatory impact processes at the moment. But what evidence have you got that willingness to pay studies overstate the general public's willingness to pay? I'm happy to table some documents on that. It's more looking at it as someone with an economics background and having willingness to pay factor into a range of assessments. Essentially, as we've heard before, these can be very complex issues. If you're trying to recover an item effectively, there are, in all likelihood, a range of options to be considered. If you were to take the general public that is being surveyed and educate them well enough to understand what those options are, they may no longer be representative of the general public. So they might say they have a greater willingness to pay to collect that item, but they're not necessarily representative anymore. A number of studies have said that when people know that a survey is related to the environment, they often overstate their willingness to be involved because it's the right thing to do. They want to be seen as being green. There are a range of litter studies over the past decade that looked at blind studies where they would survey somebody about their littering practices, and then an independent observer would observe their practices. So somebody that had just been seen littering would then be surveyed without the person doing the survey aware that they had littered, and they would say, "No, I never litter." So there is a role for that. They need to be properly structured. I'm just mindful of some of the limitations in them. What a devious piece of research. The reason I ask, I suppose, is because these are not academic questions. In the example of container deposit legislation, which I don't think you've addressed specifically in your submission, model has inserted tens of millions of dollars worth of imaginary inconvenience costs to substitute for willingness to pay, and just inserted millions and millions of dollars worth of costs that they'd basically invented to prove that it was economically unviable to do container deposits because people couldn't be bothered to pay the notional cost of taking their materials to the recycling centre. So you've offered to provide some research, if you've got anything recent that suggests that willingness to pay models maybe even overstate people's willingness to pay, then I think that would be very useful. Okay. I might leave it there, Chair. I'm not sure how we're going with time.
In looking at the willingness to pay stuff for the container deposits, I actually felt that they weren't detailed enough. There weren't enough options included in there, such as return to retail, return to depots, a range of activities that are often done to collect containers, and people's willingness to have a depot located in their community. I didn't think that it actually went far enough on some of those issues.
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Martin, for your evidence today. I think most issues I wanted to touch on. I just want to seek your thoughts. ACOR in their submission have raised some issues regarding what exactly we're looking at with product stewardship, and whilst we've gone to some of the issues as to how products may be included. They've also highlighted concerns about whether we're looking at end-of-use life cycle or end-of-use of the product, or indeed the life cycle of the product, and that there seem to be some ambiguities in the bill. Do you think the legislation is clear enough in regards to keeping a focus on the end-of-life product?
I think there was enough flexibility in the objects of the bill in particular to allow for people to demonstrate that they are considering the broader life cycle aspects throughout the life cycle, and it's not just end-of-life management. That was one of the specific issues that I was really targeting in looking at this. I think that there is actually room, realizing that framework legislation by necessity has to be broad enough to be effective over time. I think that there is room ultimately for moving to not just product-specific programs,